Kirsten Aiken. Victoria has confirmed another 77 new coronavirus cases overnight. Police have set up checkpoints at the borders of some of Melbourne's lockdown suburbs as 300,000 residents are subject to strict stay-at-home orders until the end of the month. State political reporter Richard Willingham reports.
Those border controls in 10 suburbs, 10 postcodes and 36 suburbs in Melbourne's north and west are now in place, and people aren't allowed to leave those areas. They're meant to stay at home and can only leave for work if it's essential and they can't work from home, or if they need essential food items or need to seek medical treatment. Now, this is quite drastic measures, of course, to try and put a clamp on the surge of cases that Victoria's experienced. Another 77 cases today. Chief Health Officer Brett Sutton says these are predominantly from these regions that have been locked down overnight, but they hope that this strategy of suppression in these 10 hot zones will work. But they do understand that this is quite an impediment on some communities and tens of thousands of businesses are affected. Here's what the Chief Health Officer Brett Sutton said a little earlier today.
I'm really emphasising that even though these restrictions are in place in those restricted postcodes, there's an obligation on all of us to consider how we minimise our interactions with other people. And so though the stay-at-home directions apply to those restricted postcodes, all of us across Victoria have to really consider whether we need to see people in other settings, other households, including family members and friends. That will be the best mitigation against new postcodes being included.
Brett Sutton there. The big issue that has caused this sort of outbreak or this surge in cases in Victoria has been the slippage of cases from hotel quarantine back into the community, and security guards and lax security issues have been blamed for this. No longer are private security contractors taking control of Victoria's hotel quarantine. Instead, Corrections Victoria, the people that run the prisons, are taking over. Victoria has also launched a $3 million inquiry to be led by former Judge Jennifer Coate, who was also on the Sex Abuse Royal Commission, to have a look at what went so badly wrong here in Victoria. Now, she's been given until the end of September to report back, and in looking at all government decision-making and department decision-making that has led to this crisis. Here's the Police Minister, Lisa Neville, a short time ago.
We've got a number of communities that I know are doing it really tough, and I know that they have a huge amount of frustration about being back in this position of very strict stay-at-home requirements. I feel sorry that they've had to do that. What I do know, though, is if everyone does the right thing in those communities, but right across Victoria, over the next month, we have an opportunity to get on top of this and get this under control. So the more people that comply with the restrictions and the enforcements, we know if you get good compliance, you can absolutely make a difference in relation to the spread of this virus.
So Lisa Neville there also saying that the police will be out in force to make sure people are doing the right things in these regions, because if this works, they won't need to extend these lockdowns to other suburbs, because that is a very real possibility. If this continues to spread, more of Melbourne and more of Victoria may be locked down, and that's something that nobody in this state wants.
About 50 Woolworths employees are in self-isolation after a worker at a supermarket in Sydney's Inner West tested positive for coronavirus. Our reporter Jamie McKinnell joins us now from Balmain. Jamie, what do we know about the worker and his movements?
Well, Kirsten, this man had returned to New South Wales after spending time in hotel quarantine in Victoria. The ABC understands he'd recently returned from Bangladesh. Now, he'd tested positive for coronavirus in Melbourne, but he'd been cleared. He's a worker here at the Balmain Woolworths, and he was working in the self-serve area of this supermarket. He was told by his manager that he should take another test because he had some symptoms, and now that that's come back positive, 50 workers are now in isolation, and the man has also been told to stay at home. Earlier today, we heard from the New South Wales Chief Health Officer, Dr. Kerry Chant, who confirmed that this man was cleared by Victorian authorities. She said that if somebody has no symptoms for 72 hours and if it's been at least 10 days since the onset of those symptoms, then they're deemed to be non-infectious. Here's Dr. Chant telling us more about this man's situation.
The level of virus detected is very, very low, And what this may reflect is just the tail end of the infection, but because he's also got symptoms, we're just treating it for the utmost of precaution as the fact that he could be infectious.
And so, Jamie, what is the advice from New South Wales authorities? And tell us, how are locals in Balmain feeling about the potential risk?
Well, Kirsten, Dr. Chance says this supermarket is at a low level of infectiousness. She said the reports from Woolworths suggest that even though it's quite a compact store, it's not had any issues around overcrowding or anything like that. The supermarket remains open this afternoon. It's been cleaned, and we've been speaking to shoppers here this afternoon. Some of them say they are concerned about the situation, but for others, it's not been a problem at all.
I'm glad I put the stuff on my hands before I went in.
I just got a call from my partner and she told me yes.
Are you a bit shocked?
Not really.
Oh, really? How come?
No, it's all over the world. What can you do?
Oh, okay.
Just got to be safe.
I'm sure they're taking every steps to make sure the customers are safe.
Now, the New South Wales Health Minister, Brad Hazzard, has also issued some advice for anyone who has shopped here to just be on alert for symptoms. But he's also praised Woolworths for coming out and handling this situation in a very fast manner.
OK, that's Jamie McKinnell in Sydney this afternoon. The Northern Territory has reported its first coronavirus case in 60 days. It is a man who flew in from Melbourne. Reporter Kate Ashton reports from Darwin.
This morning, Northern Territory health authorities announced a positive coronavirus case had been diagnosed in Darwin last night. The case is a Darwin man in his 30s who'd recently travelled from one of Melbourne's coronavirus hotspots. He'd been quarantining, and health authorities are assuring Territorians that the risk to the community is very low. This case, however, will bring about concerns for many Territorians, as it's the first locally diagnosed case in about 3 months. It's also been a fortnight since the Northern Territory was declared clinically free of coronavirus. Speaking this morning, government representatives said that they weren't changing their mind on opening the Territory's borders, which are due to open on the 17th of July.
Because this person has followed the rules, there is minimal risk to our community. In going forward, we don't have a cure or vaccine. We need to step forward to the new normal. When the borders, those restrictions change again on July 17th, it's not suddenly travel between jurisdictions again, but those local government areas, so AHPPC and the clinical advice, will designate those hotspots.
People who are from a hotspot in Melbourne or anywhere else in the country as they emerge are advised to stay home or will have to quarantine for 2 weeks on their arrival.
Hong Kong police have made their first arrests under the new security law that was passed by Beijing this week. Thousands of people were taking part in a band march to mark the anniversary of Britain handing the territory back to China when the police took action. The UK has now offered up to 3 million Hong Kong residents the chance to settle in the UK and ultimately apply for British citizenship. Our China correspondent Bill Birtles is live for us in Beijing this afternoon. Bill, is it clear what has happened to those arrested under the new law yesterday?
Not yet, Kirsten. We're waiting for more reports of the legal process. So police say 10 people were detained under the new law. It looks primarily like they were detained for secession crimes, promoting Hong Kong independence. In fact, the first person to be arrested under the new law was documented by police on social media. They put out pictures of this guy who had unfoiled a Hong Kong independence flag on the footpath, and police said that he was the first person to be detained under the new laws. In fact, if you zoomed in, you could see the guy had written in tiny letters, "No to Hong Kong independence," trying to legally cover himself. So the process for him, for example, will now be that if prosecutors proceed, he would face a trial, most likely in the Hong Kong legal system, but the judges who preside over these national security trials, they have to be appointed indirectly by Beijing. They have to be approved by Hong Kong's chief executive, Carrie Lam, and of course she's backed by Beijing. So it's a real change to the traditional legal system of Hong Kong, where independent judiciaries, independent courts made these rulings. And we expect only to see more arrests in the coming months, Kirsten, because the sentiment in Hong Kong clearly is still quite defiant.
Well, the law does outlaw dissent. Are pro-democracy protesters planning to hit the streets again? Is that your information?
Well, just an example of the chilling effect that the law is having. Just a few minutes ago, I was speaking to a Hong Kong lawyer who I've regularly spoken to in recent months about this law, and he's been happy to do media interviews, and he told me he's now no longer doing any media interviews because he has to assess what this new law could mean for his ability to critique the national security law. That's an example of how it is chilling and intimidating people to speak freely in the city. As for protests, last year during the protest movement, a lot of those demonstrations were loosely coordinated. It was a leaderless movement, but usually there were people circulating posters online for organised demonstrations. I'm not aware of more planned anytime soon, but I'm sure there will be, because as we saw yesterday, thousands of people on the street taking the risk. Even though there are these new, fairly draconian restrictions, they were still willing to go out there and try to protest. But as we've seen, Kirsten, 10 people arrested, so this probably will have a chilling effect.
And so do you imagine that Hong Kong residents will eagerly take up that UK offer of resettlement?
I imagine it's a lot easier said than done, even though potentially up to 3 million British overseas passport holders in Hong Kong would be eligible. The reality is, you would move to the UK as a new migrant. You would face the sort of barriers that new migrants everywhere tend to face. If English is not your first language, it's more difficult, job seeking, all these sorts of things. So it's not so simple to say, oh, let's up stumps and go to the UK or go to Taiwan, which is another government that is looking at offering pathways to Hong Kong residents. Even now we're seeing reports that the Australian government is considering some sort of visa pathway, but I think it's easier said than done. Perhaps it will be the Hong Kongers who are most prominent in the democracy movement, the people who are most at risk of being targeted by this new national security law, who would be most willing to take up these sorts of offers.
And Bill, what reaction has there been in mainland China to the international condemnation of the crackdown in Hong Kong?
China's government is furious about, particularly the United States, ending its special economic relationship with Hong Kong. Washington says we used to have trade privileges with Hong Kong that we didn't grant to the rest of China because we regarded Hong Kong as sufficiently autonomous. Now we no longer believe that's the case, so we're cutting those trade privileges off. Beijing is furious about this, claiming that it's foreign interference. It is furious about the British government offering a pathway of visas to Hong Kong residents, once again claiming that it violates international norms and it's foreign interference. At the same time, despite telling other countries to butt out from this issue, Chinese state media is full of foreigners who are being broadcast saying positive, supportive messages about this. So if a diplomat from Pakistan or some academic from Madagascar wants to say supportive things, then the Chinese government is only too happy to broadcast that to the nation. It's creating the impression here on the mainland that there's international support for this, and also, secondly, that Hong Kongers are broadly in support of this measure, which quite clearly, when you gauge the pulse of the city, they're not.
It's great to have you there, Bill Birtles in Beijing. Thank you. And as Bill mentioned, the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, has now indicated Australia may offer safe haven to Hong Kong residents facing political persecution. Foreign Affairs reporter Stephen Jedgetts joins us now from Parliament House with more. Stephen, why is there such a push from Western nations to accept potential refugees from Hong Kong?
Well, Kirsten, there's two things happening here. On the one hand, governments in places like the UK and Australia are genuinely concerned by the political repression that we've seen in Hong Kong. They're deeply worried that large numbers of activists could well be magicked back to the mainland to face arbitrary trial. There's a genuine feeling of concern in many Western capitals about exactly what it means for the future of Hong Kong. And there is, on top of that, a feeling of obligation, a sense that we really do have to take the opportunity opportunity to offer a pathway to people from Hong Kong. But